Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. In this session, we ask a question. Is it enough to know an ayah of the Quran or a hadith to prove a particular position? Is that enough? When we look at the science of Usul al-Fiqh, we get an answer to this question. And it's imperative that the Muslims today understand that comprehension of the book of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and the Sunnah has to go hand in hand with principles of understanding. We didn't say principles of interpretation. We said principles of understanding. When we look at the role of the Usuli is the one that looks into those details which are related in the Quran and the Sunnah and in the Arabic language, looking for principles and patterns, looking for consistent principles and patterns to be able to identify how to properly approach a text. So we have a series of ayat that are in the Quran, and we have a series of ahadith that constitute the Sunnah. So the Usuli will look at the Quran and the Sunnah from one side initially, and that's the side of authenticity of narration. Then the Usuli will ask the question, how do we understand these sources? How do we understand these sources? So that will take us back to a fundamental issue, and that is knowledge of the Arabic language. The other question that comes up is, what is the relationship of these two sources to one another? The Quran and the Sunnah. What is the relationship of the Sunnah to the Quran and the Quran to the Sunnah? So here we see that the Usuli is asking, what is the source of Islam? How do we know what the source is? And in the case of the Quran and the Sunnah, we're asking for the question to be dealt with. Is this authentically transmitted to us? If there's a claim that this is Quran, does it authentically come to us in a manner which we can depend upon it? If it's a hadith, is this hadith a hadith which is reliable as a source of Islam? As a source of Islam. So when it comes to the Quran, there's no issue. When it comes to the Quran, as far as its transmission, there's no issue. As far as the hadith, we have a portion of a hadith which don't need investigation, the mutawatir hadith, and then we have a portion of a hadith which need to be researched as far as their authenticity, is concerned. Right? And so those ahadith are called ahad in the thinking of the Usuli. So once we get beyond the whole issue of authentication of transmission, now we have to come to comprehending the sources. So that comprehension is going to be that we understand the Quran on its own terms, and we understand the ahadith on their own terms, and then we understand the Quran and the ahadith as they relate to one another. And this is what, before we deal with other questions like what is the role of the intellect in this whole affair? Right? Does the intellect have an independent role in understanding the Sharia, or are there guidelines? And if there are guidelines, then what types of thinking activity are acceptable and what types of thinking activity are not acceptable? So the Usuli scholar then is looking at what? The Usuli scholar is looking at the Arabic language, the Quran and the Sunnah, and he is asking, what are the patterns that govern these sources? We already dealt with the issue of authentication, so that's a discussion in itself. The Quran, we don't need to investigate its transmission, we only need to investigate its meanings. So then what comes into play is that there is going to be a categorization of sources. Once we identify the Quran and the Sunnah as authentic sources, now we're moving toward trying to understand them. So we look at the ayat. So some ayat will deal with what? Issues of halal and haram immediately. Immediately means you can see that it's dealing with halal and haram. You read it, you have a basic understanding. It's dealing with halal and haram. It's not dealing with telling us a story about the people that came of old and what was their relationship to Allah, and they were triumphant over their affairs in the dunya, or some of them failed. Not telling us about the people of the past. It's not telling us about the virtues of Tawheed and what Tawheed is. It's focused on what? It's focused on talking about halal and haram. Right? This action is permissible and this action is not permissible. So then the Usuli asks, is that it, or are there levels of permissibility and levels of prohibition? So the Usuli looks for consistent patterns to be able to identify. First, he identified that, okay, the Quran is saying this is permissible and then this is prohibited. So then we gather up ayat into the category of permissibility. We gather up ayat into the category of prohibition. Then we go further. Now we look, well, this is permissible, but this is permissible from what perspective? It's halal, but it's an obligation. It's an obligation. It has to be done. This is permissible, but from what perspective? From the perspective that it's recommended. It's recommended. It should be done, right? It should be done, but if it's left off, okay, no problem, right? Even though it comes close to being, it ought to be done. Then, this is a matter of what? Of choice. So then we have that which is what? Wajib. That which is what? Mandub or sunnah or mustahab. And then that which is mubah. Then come over here now to the side that's prohibited. Are all levels of prohibition the same? The Usuli will see this category of ayat that we have here is distinct from this category of ayat that we have down here. This category of ayat deal with what? Things which are haram. You can't do it. And then this category deals with things which are comes close to haram, disliked, shouldn't do it, but if you do it, it's not at the level of haram. So then, how is it that the Usuli comes to understand how to classify these ayat to the Arabic language? So then the Usuli looks to see, is every form of command in the Quran, in the Arabic language, open to what? To generating an obligation to do or not to do. And then he says, under these circumstances, we find a consistent pattern in the language which shows if it comes in, a command comes in this form, then you have to do it or you have to abstain. If a command comes in this particular form, it means that what? It's recommended, or means that it's what? Disliked. If it comes in, and if we find a command or we find a matter of action encouraging action, and it gives what? It gives us a choice. Gives us what? A choice. Then that's considered mubah. It's considered permissible. So the Usuli is approaching the Quran and the Sunnah from that perspective, and he goes to the Sunnah, he does the same thing. And then there's other issues that the Usuli gets into. Let's put the command issues aside now. The Usuli now comes and starts to ask another question, right? And this could be before dealing with the commands, but I'm just trying to get you to think how the Usuli is thinking. He says, we're going to classify these ayat in one group and these ayat in another group. These ayat are the ayat which are clear. There's no debate about their meaning. These ayat are unclear, right? So then the Usuli will come and say, are there ayat which are clear and don't need any interpretation? Yeah, they call them muhkim. Are there ayat, put that aside, are there ayat which vary in their understanding? Yeah, and they call them mutashabihat. Sometimes when people say mutashabihat, they say the meanings can't be understood, and that's not totally correct. So in another categorization, we can say these ayat are clear, these ayat are unclear. The ayat that are clear, there's no discussion. Now the ayat that are unclear, they're at levels. The top is understandable, but it's possible that it can be understood in another way. the least or the bottom categorization, right, or the categorization, right, which is the most unclear, right, the least clear, in other words. I was alluding to that a minute ago. And those ayat, we call them mutashabihat. In the what? In the sense that their understanding is very difficult, right? So the term mutashabihat is used in a few different ways. So that's the Usul gets into that type of thinking, right? He gets into that type of thinking. So then in the ayat that are not so clear, how do we explain them? We explain them from the Arabic language. We said we look for patterns. We explain them through other ayat. So this one may be general, this one may be specific, and we bring the two together, right? That type of concept. This one may be absolute, and this one may be qualified. We bring them together, right? So the same type of process continues to take place, right? The same type of process continues to take place when what? We have an ayat that is clarifying an ayat which needs to be clear, right? Right? So then now we ask the question. Here we have what? A series of ayat which are classified. And they relate to one another. And they in the beginning stage of understanding comprehension, they were unclear, and then when we brought them together, they became more clear. And we were only able to achieve that by designating a category for them, for these ayat, and then seeing how they match with one another. So now the question comes, what is the role of the sunnah? So the sunnah may play the same role. It may clarify, it may qualify, right? It may specify. And so now then we have to see how the Quran and the sunnah relate to one another, right? And so then that's how we deal with the Quran and the Sunnah. So then the Usuli also asks, are there any other primary proofs that we rely upon to find out what is Islam? So then now we find this whole concept of ijma or consensus. Ijma or consensus. There's a time period in which what? The Ummah will come together on some issues and say, this is what this means and this is how we practice, and that's it. And it has to be something that's already understood in the Quran and the Sunnah. So then that ijma or that consensus clarifies and stifles any other investigation. That is how it is to be practiced, how it is to be understood. And that doesn't always take place. But there are some issues which are completely agreed upon. Then we have the issue of what do you do in the case when the Quran and the Sunnah don't directly speak to an issue? Like, for instance, the famous example that we all know, the example of drinking alcohol. The Quran and the Sunnah are clear on that. But what about drugs? Do the Quran and the Sunnah speak about drugs? If we don't find that the Quran and the Sunnah directly speak about drugs, so then how is it that we can practice our deen if there are some issues which the Quran and the Sunnah don't directly speak about? Well, this is where the concept of analogy comes in. Analogy extends the ruling that's in the Quran and the Sunnah to a situation which is very similar to that which is clear in the Quran. So drugs and alcohol are very similar in impact and effect. The underlying cause that makes the two similar is that both are intoxicants. So from there we draw an analogy from case number A, alcohol, to case number D, or code D, drugs. And so the similarity between them is what? Intoxication. Intoxication is not permissible in the deen. Therefore, drugs are not permissible. Right? And so that's the way that people in Usul al-Fiqh come to understand how to deal with the sources. Now, some may say, well, what about this? What about that? Well, then now we have to keep moving on in our thinking of Usul al-Fiqh. This is just an introduction. To understand that, looking at an ayah of the Quran and a hadith and furnishing it as proof is not enough. You also have to have understanding. You have to have fiqh.